At 0900 hours on February 19th, 1945, the first waves of U.S. Marines stepped onto the black volcanic sand of Iwo Jima. From offshore, the island did not look large. 8 square miles of dark rock, low ridges, and one dominating feature, Mount Suribachi on the southern tip. For months, American planners had treated Iwo Jima as an airfield problem. 3 Japanese airstrips sat in the middle of the island. Those airfields allowed enemy fighters to intercept B-29 bombers flying from the Marianas to Japan. Take the island, neutralize the airfields, and the bombing campaign became safer. On paper, it was a straightforward objective. In reality, it was one of the most difficult tactical environments the U.S. Marine Corps had ever faced. Under the surface, Iwo Jima was not a small island. It was a buried fortress. Japanese engineers working under General Tadamichi Kuribayashi had spent over a year turning the island into a defensive system. Miles of tunnels connected underground barracks, ammunition rooms, artillery positions, and command posts. Many firing points were cut directly into the rock, with narrow openings barely visible from the sea. Naval bombardment had hit the island for days. Shells had smashed the topsoil, collapsed some trenches, and destroyed surface structures. But the critical parts of the defense, tunnels, deep shelters, and hidden gun positions, remained intact. When the first assault waves moved inland from the beach, they discovered the problem very quickly. Fire did not come from obvious bunkers directly in front of them. It came from flanks, from high ground, from positions that looked like solid rock until they opened up. Machine guns fired from small cracks in the hillsides. Mortars launched from pits hidden behind ridges. Artillery guns rolled out from caves, fired, then disappeared back behind steel doors. Standard infantry tactics struggled in this environment. The Marines could locate an approximate firing point, bring in artillery or naval gunfire, watch the target disappear in smoke, and then receive fire from the same area again once the smoke cleared. It was the same pattern seen in New Guinea and the Solomons, but concentrated onto a much smaller area and protected by volcanic rock rather than soil or coral. By the end of the first day, it was clear that Iwo Jima would not be taken quickly. U.S. forces had tanks on the island from the beginning. Standard M4 Shermans landed with the assault waves intended to support infantry against pillboxes and provide mobile firepower inland. They performed as expected on open ground, but Iwo Jima did not offer much open ground. The volcanic ash made movement difficult. Tracks sank, engines strained, and visibility from cupolas and periscopes was limited by dust and the uneven terrain. More importantly, the main gun of a Sherman could not solve the tunnel problem. A 75mm high-explosive shell could destroy a visible bunker or collapse part of a cave entrance, but it could not reach defenders who had withdrawn around a bend in the tunnel. A position might go quiet after an impact, only to resume firing once the crew reoccupied it through a secondary passage. Portable flamethrowers existed and were used extensively. Marine assault teams carried them to bunker mouths and cave openings. They were effective at short range, but the operator had to stand in an exposed position within a few dozen feet of the target. Casualties for flamethrower teams were high. The logical conclusion was simple. If a flamethrower was effective but vulnerable, it needed armor. The U.S. had already experimented with flamethrower tanks in earlier campaigns in the Pacific. On Saipan and Tinian, modified Shermans had been used in limited numbers to clear fortified positions. Iwo Jima would be the first battle where such tanks were integrated as a core part of the assault plan. The vehicles that arrived on Iwo Jima were standard Shermans converted into flame tanks in cooperation between the U.S. Army's Chemical Warfare Service and Marine tank battalions. In most conversions, the original main gun was removed or reduced, and a flame projector was installed in the turret, disguised to resemble a conventional cannon from a distance. Internally, the tank carried fuel tanks for the flame agent, compressed gas systems to pressurize the flow, and control valves operated by the gunner. The effective range of these flame projectors was significantly greater than that of a man-portable unit. Depending on mixture and pressure, they could project burning fuel well over 100 feet, and in some reports, under ideal conditions, approaching 150 to 180 feet. This meant flame tanks could stand off at a relatively safer distance while still reaching into cave openings and bunker apertures. On Iwo Jima, Marine commanders quickly learned where these capabilities mattered most.
Natural features such as the slopes of Mount Suribachi, the cliffs along the western shore, and the ridges in the northern sector were filled with interconnected caves. In many cases, engineers and infantry identified entrances, marked them with colored smoke, and then called forward flamethrower Shermans to neutralize the positions. The procedure was straightforward. Infantry suppressed visible openings. A flame tank moved up with supporting regular Shermans. Once in position, the tank traversed its projector calculated distance and fired a short burst into the entrance. Reports from units on the ground described consistent effects: immediate cessation of fire from treated positions, secondary detonations from ammunition inside, and no further need to assault that specific cave by hand. As with all battlefield reports, some accounts may contain exaggeration, but the pattern remains clear. Flame tanks reduced the number of frontal assaults that infantry had to make against prepared, hidden positions. The tactical value of these vehicles came with significant risks. From the Japanese point of view, flame tanks were priority targets. Japanese infantry and gun crews understood that these vehicles posed a greater threat than standard Shermans. A conventional tank could be avoided by withdrawing deeper into the tunnel. A flame tank, if allowed to approach, could make the entire tunnel system untenable. As a result, Japanese anti-tank efforts concentrated heavily on them. Suicide attacks with explosives, charges placed directly under the hull or tracks at night, and concentrated anti-tank fire were directed first at flame tanks whenever they were identified. Volcanic ash increased this vulnerability. The terrain restricted maneuver, making it harder for tanks to change position quickly once they came under fire. Despite these dangers, Marine after-action reports and later historical analyses reached the same conclusion. Where flame tanks were present and operational, assaults on heavily fortified sectors became faster and less costly in infantry casualties. One report from the 4th Marine Division summarized it in simple terms: a single flame tank, correctly employed, could do the work of many rifle squads against a cave complex. By the end of the first week on Iwo Jima, flamethrower Shermans were no longer an experiment. They were an integral part of the method by which American forces advanced. Planners did not speak of taking hills with infantry alone. They spoke of fixing enemy fire with small arms and artillery, identifying entrances and firing points, then bringing forward flame tanks to finish positions that had survived repeated bombardment. This combined approach, infantry, engineers, conventional Shermans, and flamethrower Shermans operating as a team, repeatedly appeared in unit logs and diaries. Before we go deeper into how these tanks were used in specific sectors of the island, and how Japanese defenders reacted to them, if you appreciate calm, detailed history like this, consider subscribing to the channel. The more you watch and subscribe, the more rare and technical parts of World War I we can bring back into focus. In the next part, we will look at individual actions where flamethrower Shermans played a decisive role, from the slopes of Mount Suribachi to the final bitter fighting in the northern plateau, and examine what Japanese and American participants wrote about these machines after the battle was over. When Marines secured the southern beaches and began moving toward Mount Suribachi, it became clear that the mountain itself would be the first major test of flamethrower Shermans. Suribachi was not simply high ground. It was a self-contained defensive zone. Japanese engineers had carved its slopes and interior for over a year. Gun chambers were dug into the mountain's face. Observation points were positioned to see all approaches. Artillery pieces on internal tracks could roll forward, fire, and retreat into tunnels protected by steel doors. Infantry advancing on foot reported the same pattern repeatedly. Fire came from places where no openings were visible. Machine gun crews shifted between hidden apertures. Mortar teams operated from chambers cut deep into the rock. Anti-tank guns fired from positions disguised as natural cracks. The terrain was so rough that standard infantry support weapons could not be brought forward easily. Mortars sank into ash. Tripods slipped on loose volcanic sand. Even moving ammunition required teams of Marines hauling boxes by hand. Under these conditions, armored support was essential. The first flame tanks reached the base of Suribachi late in the afternoon of February February 20th. Reports indicate that at least 6 converted Shermans from the 4th and 5th Tank Battalions were present during the early phases of the assault. The method employed by Marine commanders was consistent with earlier doctrine. Infantry advanced until fire pinned them. Engineers marked cave entrances with colored smoke. Flame tanks moved up alongside standard Shermans, then delivered bursts of flame into openings, withdrawing before Japanese guns could respond. One battalion log recorded that during the first full day of operations on Suribachi's slopes, a single flame tank was called forward 17 times in 3 hours. Some bursts were as short as 1 second. Others were extended sprays designed to saturate deep openings. Infantry observed immediate effects. Gunfire from treated positions stopped almost instantly. In several cases, secondary explosions erupted deep within caves, suggesting ammunition or fuel stores ignited by the flame. Marines tasked with clearing the upper slopes reported that progress doubled once flame tanks were consistently available. The difference between possible to advance and impossible to advance often depended on whether flame tanks could reach the position safely. Not every attempt succeeded. The terrain around Suribachi restricted movement severely. Volcanic ash created soft pockets where tanks bogged down. Sharp rock ridges forced them into predictable paths. Japanese defenders adapted quickly. Anti-tank guns hidden in cave mouths waited until a tank lined up for a flame burst, then opened fire at close range. In several cases, flame tanks were disabled before they could fire. Japanese infantry also targeted the vehicles at night. Assault teams armed with mines and satchel charges attempted to approach under cover of darkness. Tank crews recorded multiple close calls, including charges detonated near the tracks and small arms fire directed at vision blocks and periscopes. Despite these risks, flame tanks continued operating as long as they remained mobile. After Suribachi was encircled and eventually captured on February 23rd, attention shifted north to a larger, more complex system of ridges and defensive lines. This northern sector contained the hardest fighting of the entire campaign, and it was here that flame tanks played their most sustained role. The terrain north of the airfields was a series of natural and artificial obstacles. The amphitheater Turkey Knob, the quarry, Hill 382, the Rock Quarry Ridge, and the so-called Meat Grinder, a cluster of positions with overlapping fields of fire. Each of these sites was connected by tunnels and secondary entrances. Destroying one position rarely neutralized the next. Marine infantry units advancing into this region typically encountered the same circular problem. They could suppress visible openings, but could not reach the concealed spaces where Japanese defenders waited. In the days following the initial landings, unit commanders began allocating flame tanks to assault teams by default. They were no longer treated as special assets to be called forward only when needed. They became part of the standard approach to every fortified objective. A typical attack might proceed as follows. Infantry advanced to gain initial contact. Japanese guns opened fire from multiple directions. Marines marked likely firing points with smoke. Standard Shermans delivered machine gun and he fired to suppress surface apertures. Flame tanks moved into position, delivering precise bursts into openings confirmed by engineers or scouts. Once fire ceased, infantry advanced to the next ridge. This pattern repeated dozens of times across 10 days of fighting. Tank after-action summaries provide a clearer picture of how central these vehicles had become. One crew from the 5th Tank Battalion reported supporting an infantry company for almost 6 consecutive hours during the assault on Turkey Knob. The flame tank fired into over 30 separate openings, often returning to the same location after defenders attempted to reoccupy it through secondary tunnels. In another case, during operations near Hill 362, a single flame tank accounted for 14 caves neutralized in less than 90 minutes. Marines attempting to approach one complex on foot had taken casualties from crossfire. Once the flame tank reached the area, cave openings fell silent one by one. Japanese defenders reacted strongly. Intelligence reports recovered after the battle included multiple references to fire tanks as priority targets. Diaries found on the island indicated that flame tanks caused significant psychological pressure on defenders inside tunnels, forcing them to retreat deeper or abandon positions temporarily. Japanese commanders attempted countermeasures. Some cave entrances were modified to include steep angles, or baffles designed to limit the reach of the flames. Others placed machine guns deeper into tunnels to cut down assault teams before tanks could approach. However, these adaptations rarely stopped flame tanks entirely. They simply made operations slower. The strain on the vehicles themselves was considerable. Flame tanks carried more internal equipment than standard Shermans, and their fuel mixtures required careful handling. Tanks sometimes needed to withdraw not because of damage, but because their flame reservoirs were empty after extended operations. Maintenance crews worked long hours to keep the tanks functional in the ash-heavy environment. Heat exchangers, pumps, and valves required constant cleaning. The fine volcanic dust infiltrated everything: engines, bearings, fuel lines. Nevertheless, Marine armored companies kept a consistent number of flame tanks active throughout the battle. Their contribution became so central that some infantry officers wrote in their reports that certain objectives could not be taken without flame tank support. By early March, the northern defenses had begun to collapse. Japanese resistance remained intense, but the tunnel systems were shrinking as positions were eliminated systematically. Flame tanks were used less frequently in the final week, not because they were less effective, but because fewer major cave complexes remained. When the island was declared secure on March 26, Marine commanders evaluated the tools that had made progress possible. Alongside artillery, naval gunfire, and infantry assault teams, flamethrower Shermans were listed as one of the decisive capabilities of the operation. They provided a way to overcome a defense built explicitly to resist conventional firepower. They reduced casualties among assaulting infantry. They denied Japanese defenders the ability to reoccupy cave systems after preliminary bombardment, and they demonstrated, perhaps more than any other weapon, the necessity of specialized armor in the Pacific Island campaigns. In the next part of this documentary, we will examine individual flame tank crews, the tactical coordination between tanks and engineers, and the Japanese perspective recorded after the battle. If you want more detailed military history like this, make sure you're subscribed. There is still a lot to uncover. By early March 1945, fighting on northern Iwo Jima had turned into a slow, methodical reduction of remaining tunnel complexes. The Japanese garrison, cut off from reinforcement and supplies, continued to resist from narrow chambers and blind corners that could not be reached by infantry alone. It was during this period that the performance of flamethrower Sherman crews drew the attention of Marine headquarters. Their logs, interviews, and after-action reports now provide a clear understanding of how these vehicles operated under extreme conditions. Crew experience and workload. A standard Sherman crew consisted of 5 men, but flame tanks had modified roles: driver responsible for maneuvering in volcanic ash, assistant driver, gunner, tank commander, coordinating with infantry, flame gun operator, managing pressure, angle, combustion loader / mechanic, monitoring the system from inside. Unlike standard Shermans, flame crews needed training in fuel pressure systems, igniters, pump assemblies, and emergency procedures in case of internal leaks or overheating. Many crews reported that they spent more time maintaining equipment than sleeping. One tank commander wrote in his log, "We were not fighting the Japanese as much as the island itself. The ash, the heat, the dust, they wore the tanks down every hour." Crews also carried additional canisters, spare ignition wires, and emergency extinguishers. The volcanic environment created complications that did not exist on Saipan or Tinian: ash-clogged filters, abrasive dust ground into moving parts, and high temperatures caused pump units to overheat. Even so, crews maintained operational readiness rates above 70%, a significant achievement given the conditions. Coordination with engineers. One of the most important aspects of flame tank operations was coordination with Marine engineers. Engineers used mirrors, periscopes, and poles to probe for cave entrances hidden by vegetation or collapsed rock. Once an opening was confirmed, engineers marked it with yellow smoke for flamethrower tanks, blue smoke for standard Shermans, red smoke for artillery observers. This color system prevented confusion in chaotic terrain. It allowed tank commanders to identify their targets instantly, without requiring infantry to expose themselves. Engineers also cleared narrow paths for tanks by cutting through rough terrain, guiding vehicles around soft ash pockets, and identifying potential ambush points. The cooperation between tanks and engineers became one of the most effective combined arms methods used on Iwo Jima. Tactical patterns. Over the course of the battle, three distinct tactical methods emerged. 1. Sweep and seal used against large tunnel complexes. Standard Shermans opened with high explosive rounds. Engineers identified and marked cave entrances. Flame tanks approached at low angle. Short flame bursts were delivered to force back defenders. Longer bursts saturated chambers deeper inside. Infantry advanced once fire stopped. This method eliminated the possibility of defenders returning through secondary tunnels to reopen fire. 2. Rolling suppression used in ridge fighting. Flame tanks delivered rapid bursts into multiple openings. Infantry advanced behind the tank's right side. The safer angle machine guns covered the left side. To suppress counterfire, this method was repeated ridge by ridge across northern Iwo Jima. 3. Targeted burn used when frontal approaches were impossible. Tanks fired flame through cracks, ventilation shafts, or collapsed rock. Engineers confirmed effects by sound and temperature changes at cave entrances. Infantry monitored for reappearance of fire from side tunnels. This method required precise coordination, as flame tanks had limited vertical angle. Japanese reaction. Japanese defenders quickly recognized the danger posed by flame tanks. Intelligence collections from captured diaries and interrogations highlighted several patterns. Defenders were instructed to conceal secondary cave entrances, to prevent tanks from approaching position, anti-tank guns in deep recesses, firing only when tanks exposed their sides, target tank periscopes to blind drivers, and commanders attempt night infiltration against disabled tanks, fire from unexpected angles, to force flame tanks into narrow paths. Despite these efforts, the effectiveness of flame tanks was not significantly reduced. Many Japanese units lacked the heavy weapons necessary to destroy tanks consistently. Mines and satchel charges were dangerous but required close approach, which became increasingly difficult as Marines secured more ground. Several diaries described flame tanks as the most dangerous enemy weapon on the island, more feared than artillery or aircraft. Effectiveness and statistics. Precise records vary, but Marine after-action summaries list approximate results. Over 600 cave positions neutralized with flame tanks present hundreds of secondary tunnels seal. More than 80% of major fortified complexes treated at least once by flame Shermans. Significant reduction in infantry casualties during assaults on Turkey Knob Hill. 362 and the amphitheater. One infantry officer wrote, "Without flame tanks, progress would have slowed to a crawl. They were the only means of clearing the deep positions that could not be reached by explosives or rifle fire." Tank battalions also reported losses. Mechanical failures due to volcanic ash. Several vehicles immobilized in soft ground. A number disabled by hidden anti-tank guns. Frequent maintenance issues requiring withdrawal. Even so, flame tanks maintained operational tempo throughout the campaign. Aftermath and strategic impact. When the battle ended on March 26, U.S. forces had secured one of the most fortified islands in the Pacific. The battle cost over 26,000 Marine casualties, but the presence of flame tanks undoubtedly prevented the number from rising even higher. After the battle, U.S. Army and Marine Corps analysts compiled reports evaluating the effectiveness of all armored assets. Flamethrower Shermans were rated as one of the most decisive specialized weapons used in Pacific Island operations. Their success on Iwo Jima influenced later planning. Okinawa used an expanded number of flame tanks. Post-war doctrines emphasized the need for assault armor. Engineers and tank units formalized cave-clearing tactics. The lessons learned contributed to post-war designs for specialized assault vehicles, including flamethrower variants of later U.S. tanks. Conclusion. The battle for Iwo Jima is remembered for the flag raising on Suribachi and the heavy casualties suffered by Marines advancing across the island. But within the technical and tactical details of the campaign lies a clear fact. Flamethrower Shermans were essential. They enabled progress where infantry alone could not advance. They neutralized defensive systems designed to resist artillery, bombs, and direct fire. And they allowed assault teams to dismantle deeply embedded cave networks without catastrophic losses. For these reasons, military historians consistently list flame tanks as one of the critical components that made the American victory on Iwo Jima possible.